Live.
All right, we're live. Welcome everybody to Marsh Chat. This is a series of conversations with marsh scientists, scholars, marsh enthusiasts, and importantly, salt marsh managers as well. Our Hangouts on Air are part of an MIT Sea Grant funded program, and they will generally be hosted by Mr. Marsh himself, Marc Hensel, a PhD student here at UMass Boston. I'm Jarrett Burns. I'm kind of the coordinator of all of this. You'll see me on and off, but really this is all about Marc. Today, we're privileged to be talking with Christine Angelini from the University of Florida, but I'll let Marc make the introductions and take it from there. Okay, Marc.
Awesome. Thanks, Jarrett. Yeah, so like Jarrett said, we're going to be hosting these chats, and we're going to talk to a bunch of great marsh scientists, marsh managers. And the first one is Christine Angelini, who is, in fact, a great marsh scientist. So Christine and the youngest marsh ecologist that I know, Vernetta, are joining us from the University of Florida. So Christine is a marsh community ecologist, and Christine, if you don't mind, could you just give like a little sentence or two about your research interests?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Christine Angelini. I'm currently in environmental engineering sciences at the University of Florida, an assistant professor there, and in my second year. And my interests are generally in experimental community ecology, and more recently starting to transition into thinking how we can link ecology and coastal engineering, coastal oceanography to understand issues of coastal resiliency. So, how do we maintain ecosystem services in the face of climate change and intensive human development of our coasts? So that's my general interest.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah. So. Kind of springing off of your interests in changing marsh ecosystem services and stuff like that, why do you think studying salt marshes is important?
Well, I'm an East Coaster, and if you look at much of the East Coast of the United States, salt marshes are what fringe our coastlines and are our natural sort of barriers of defense from both the oceanic side and storm surges, and therefore they provide a high degree of coastal protection. But they're also acting as our sort of natural filters from the terrestrial environment and what reaches the open ocean. And so I think they're this incredibly dynamic, widespread interface at which the land and the sea are interacting, and have, given the concentration of humans along our coastline, have tremendous implications, the health of these ecosystems for human communities. So I think they're ecologically valuable and economically valuable ecosystems to study, and they're at a credible sort of facing many challenges with sea level rise and coastal development. So we have a lot of issues to address at maintaining these systems.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, especially living up here in New England now, that salt marshes are ecosystems that have been impacted by humans for so long. I mean, living in Boston, we have this this rich neighborhood called Back Bay. It literally used to be a salt marsh. I've got some cool old maps of Boston and New England, and so much of it is marsh. So many of the big major cities along the East Coast are former marshes and stuff. And so it's marshes are like you said, where the land meets the sea, and we've been doing things to them for such a long time. I mean, marshes were considered wasteland for forever, and and now we know so much about their how valuable they are and stuff. And so full disclosure to the millions of viewers that are listening and watching us. So Christine and I used to work together at University of Florida. Christine and I actually did geographically a swap. She started up in New England and then moved down to the southeast. I started down in the southeast and moved up to New England. I think we both have kind of a cool perspective on the differences between northeastern and southeastern marshes. To me, one of the biggest differences is fewer alligators in the Northeast, a lot fewer of those. But Christine, what are some of the biggest differences between southern and northern United States marshes to you?
I mean, for me, the biggest striking difference is what builds the foundation of the marsh. In the Northeast, these are peat-based marshes. And so when you walk out, they're really hard, and there's a lot of organic matter in the soil. And so they're accreted largely through the deposition of below-ground plant material. And you go down to these southern marshes, and there are these big sediment-based marshes, which means the sediment input is a lot greater sort of contribution to what physically builds the vertical, platform of the marsh. And the organic content is certainly, or contribution of the plants to building these marshes is certainly important, but less so or it's certain the sediment component is certainly a lot bigger driver of marsh growth in the South. So from like a geological perspective, it's those fundamental drivers of marsh formation that are different in the North and the South. Of course, the suites of organisms are really different. You don't have some of these bigger apex predators in these northern marshes, and the population densities are are different as well. So we get these loading of invertebrates, especially along the barrier islands of Georgia and the southeastern coast, and population densities of a lot of these invertebrates are far lower, at least on the marsh platform in these northern marshes. So even though the suite of plants is very similar, their spatial distribution, of course, changes with latitude, but I think a lot about the sort of biodiversity that these marshes support, and the total abundance of organisms, and that varies as well with latitude. So I mean, and you bring up difference in marsh resident populations and stuff, and there's also to turn a phrase, there's also a big difference in the human populations around marshes of the Northeast and in the Southeast too. I mean, that's one of the striking things to me is pretty much every marsh in New England is surrounded by houses. So much more ditching has been done, and the building of roads over the marsh, that sort of thing. I mean, like I said earlier, all the cities that have been built on the marsh. I mean, and just population density is so much lower, so much more spread out. Population is down in the Southeast, and that's got to have a huge impact as well. I mean, we talk about a lot of the impacts that eutrophication, that nutrient runoff has on marshes, and it's so much more of a problem up here in New England than it is down in the Southeast. And I mean, it's one of those things. To me, it's this kind of compounding problem when we talk about what's negatively affecting salt marshes. Like you said, marshes are a sponge for nutrient runoff, and as you'd expect, the bigger the marsh is, likely the more chance it has of the roots sucking up nutrients, that sort of thing. And so if there's nutrients running off of a marsh in the Southeast, those marshes are really, really big, and you'd expect it to do a pretty good job of sucking up that extra nitrogen or the extra the oils and stuff that come from cars and that sort of thing. Whereas New England, there's so many of these little pocket marshes. I know that it's like the column stuff, and so it's this interesting double problem where the marshes are smaller, but there's higher population, so we even need them more. I mean, these little pocket marshes are maybe even proportionally more important than the big untouched marshes of the Southeast, which is really interesting to me. If you were to put a dollar amount on a square hectare of marsh in the South versus the North, kind of equated with the value of the services, at least in terms of if you were to think about it in terms of nutrient removal, perhaps per square foot, these northern marshes are relatively more valuable than the southern marshes. But I wonder if you were to talk about it in terms of kind of production of other ecosystem services, like food production, whether the southern marshes, them being more productive systems, whether basically the distribution of services and their value on a per unit area basis, how that varies with latitude. That would be a cool thing to do, but you're totally right. I mean, I think about those northern marshes as like little postage stamps. They're these tiny little pockets along the shoreline, and you don't see a tree line anymore. You just see a house line fringing those marshes, and that's pretty different from parts of the Southeast. We were really privileged to work along, some of these stretches of the Georgia coast where, well, the marsh systems themselves are so extensive, but human population density was relatively low there. But I've started working in Florida, and that's not so much the case. All of a sudden, we're back down to super intensive, human development. And one of the things I see a lot sort of impacting the marshes is the number of docks too, that you have direct kind of physical impacts of humans. These South Carolina and Georgia and Florida marshes, it's like a grid work of docks for people to walk over their marsh and get out to the channels, and their boats. And I think that drives a really different disturbance dynamic in these southern marshes as well. You get a lot of rack accumulation along those structures. So,
definitely a lot of. I mean, it's a cool thing because we don't get credit for switching to a different ecosystem, but processes are so different. North and south. It's been a really interesting comparison. And I think that we should follow up on that, how ecosystem services vary with latitude question.
I kind of love that idea. I mean, this sort of concept of thinking about the per hectare sort of both dollar value, but also thinking about number of ecosystem services, evaluation of ecosystem services. And not just ecosystem services for people, but also just thinking about ecosystem functions and sort of the relative importance for. I mean, one reason that I love marshes is they're the juncture of the land and the sea, right? Like they're where your forest border ends up meeting the ocean in this sort of really wild, beautiful grassland. Grassland. Some of my terrestrial ecologist friends would sort of scoff at that, but be that as it may. This idea that you have sort of a change in the relative, not relative importance, because they're just important in different ways, and sort of how you can quantify that.
I think the distribution of services is going to vary, thinking about carbon sequestration too, and actually even pools of where that carbon stands in northern versus, southern marshes, and support of fisheries production and biodiversity, all of these kinds of things. It would be pretty interesting. And, Mark and I are almost doing this dichotomy of like southern, thinking about the Georgia marshes that we know really well and these New England marshes around Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But then we've got this whole suite of marshes in, the Central Coast that, for areas that are super highly developed, that are providing a lot of storm surge protection as well, and how it, maybe some of these services are relative to local human demands as well, too. Yeah,
well, that's a cool point. I mean, the sort of coupled human natural system perspective, as the lingo goes. But this sort of broad idea that people rely on marshes for different services. So while it may be that marshes, say, in New England provide a service that isn't provided in, let's say, like Maryland, it may be that people don't rely on them for that service. So the fact that that service is gained or lost doesn't matter. So you actually need to explicitly say, what do people need and what do people want, and what are the things that we would value these for? And that's going to change geographically as well. So it's a question that you really need to attack from both sides. Yeah. Cool. Well, proposal ideas.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and we'll have to cut that from the internet so people don't steal it.
Or get a big network of collaborators help, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Very cool. So, Christine, I mean, we've talked a lot about, valuation of salt marshes and stuff. So this might be part of your answer, but where do you think we should be headed with salt marsh research? What's the next step? We know a lot about salt marsh community ecology. We've done a really good job, fleshing out a lot of the food web interactions, that sort of thing. I mean, we've known about salt marsh ecosystem ecology for a really long time. What do you think? What do you think the next step is for us to understand what's going on with marshes?
I mean, I think everything has to be, thinking about changes in sea level and issues of coastal resiliency. I think that's like whether these systems are going to persist in the future and what they're going to look like in the face of increased storms, surges. And I mean, I see that dumping huge piles of sediment on these northern marshes, creating all kinds of disturbance dynamics in marshes that, are unforeseen. And so I think it's a matter of, it's two things. One, understanding what those kind of more intensifying impacts are going to do to the structure and functions of our marshes, and what can we learn from systems that are performing relatively better under these stressors, where we could, use that to inform proactive management. So, I think a lot about mussels and how they sort of maybe, they stimulate marsh production, and in doing so maybe playing a role in sort of the allowing these systems to keep pace with sea level rise. Can you harness positive interactions, things that we've learned from the trophic ecology of these, or the community ecology of these ecosystems, to sort of proactively gear management towards combating some of these changes. But I think that the other thing is the reality that these systems are already existing in a very developed kind of, humans, we've been talking about it over the course of this interview so far, it's so dynamic, how much of an influence humans have on these systems. And we're going to need to be coupling things like engineering of our coastlines. It's going to be a mix of natural and hard structures. And I think for marsh ecologists to start working with civil engineers and coastal engineers and people that are actually building some of these hard structures, at least that's my perspective now that I'm in a department that
you're literally doing that.
People that are like that I think it's actually really beneficial, because their perspective on how to protect our coastlines are really different. And being able to talk to people that have that perspective and think about how do you look at the effects of some of these harder structures on the natural systems, how do you integrate the natural systems in a way into these hard structures that makes them more effective. I think that's where we need to go, is kind of this interaction and try to getting out of the box of just talking to biologists and ecologists, and realizing that when people are planning for sea level rise in Miami, they're talking to ecologists a little bit, but they're talking to engineers and people that work with water resources and those huge urban infrastructure kinds of engineering ideas. And I think that just we need to be in the room for those conversations and thinking about it in that very interdisciplinary way.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear what you think about this. And my opinion about marshes and sort of global change is not nearly as bleak as the outlook, at least I think for a lot of other ecosystems like coral reefs, for example, where things there's these multiple stresses where things don't look good at all. From some of our experience, I think that marshes are a very, very resilient system. I mean, you have a very cool story about mussels and resilience, which I think you should tell at least how you came up with that, how you found it out after this. But some of the things that we've seen in our research from the Southeast is the research that our advisor Brian Silliman did on the oil spill, which is for the first few years, the oil was really bad. It increased erosion by 3 times, right? 5 times, something like that. But after, what was it, 3 years, things started to calm down, and and they kind of went back to normal. And I think that there's been tons of research. I again may be wrong exactly, but I think a lot of the Fagarazzi research has shown that historically marshes have kept up with changing sea level rise. Obviously, things haven't been as fast as they are now. And and one of the big problems is marshes have been able to move backwards towards the upland edge, where now there's houses and that sort of thing there. But I think that marshes are really resilient, and especially given all that we know about how marshes function and the services they provision, that it shouldn't I don't think we're facing as big of a hurdle as I brought up coral reef ecologists or coral reef managers, where they have to worry about all of these different factors. I think that if we do things along the lines of what you're talking about, work closely with the people who are managing the coastline, that we have a real chance to preserve marshes and to more importantly preserve their services.
Yeah, I mean, I just think the general idea of having a positive message too, and that we can kind of make some change is really important for all of us staying, that we're working on something that's valuable, because it's not just going to disappear in 20 years anyways, but that I think just having a positive message that actually humans can have collectively we can have a positive influence, and maybe not all of our natural systems are going to totally disappear, and rather than having this really glim outlook on what our future is. But I think that some of that is maybe you've got a really overly positive view, Mark, too, that everything's like
I've been
really,
accused of that before.
these marshes, they're going to really be able to hang in there. And but I also think that it's some of these things of like these, you talked about, the ability of these, the Gulf Coast marshes to sort of like eventually stop retreating so quickly after this oil spill, but they still retreated, meters, and so you've still lost. Multiply that out by the coastline impacted, and you still lost a sizable sort of chunk of marsh from just that one event. And even though it slows down, trying to understand, okay, as those kind of events increase in frequency and severity, at what point is the system, no longer showing such great resilience? But I agree. I mean, it's something where, just watching these southern marshes recover from drought, the vegetation charges back, and we see some, you do see recovery, and you do see the system. It's been, dynamic and changing, and so it's withstanding some of these stressors, maybe more than you'd initially expect.
Yeah. So, Christine, if you don't mind, could you tell us the story of how you first discovered the mussel resilience story in the marsh? It's one of my favorites.
Okay. Well, sure, Mark. I'd be happy to. Yeah. So. Well, I think it's relevant for people who haven't been out in a southern marsh, but just so in the higher marsh platform, which is the area that's just inundated during high tide periods, a couple of hours a day, between 2 and 4 hours a day. During neap tides, these areas lay dry for 3 to 4 days sometimes, and during the summer, when these high platforms lay dry, they can experience a lot of evaporation and basically spikes in salinity. And so they're the most vulnerable areas during drought for the marsh soils to go through all these biogeochemical changes that scorch the grass and create these big die-off areas. And that interacts with snail grazing. That's, Brian Silliman's whole dissertation research was about these interactions. But one thing we noticed during a drought in this 2010-2011 drought was walking out into these areas that were going through die-off was the vegetation was still bright green and alive, in particular where it was growing in close association with these mounds of rib mussels. So Gukenzia demissa forms these really tight aggregations in the high marsh platform. And we know that this is a mutualism between the cordgrass and the mussels, where the cordgrass shades the mussels and provides them some food resources. You find kind of decaying spartina in the guts and in the trophic or the stable isotope signature of the mussels. And the mussels, in turn, we know are fertilizing the vegetation through their deposition of nutrient-rich pseudofeces. But the idea that this mutualism could be protecting the spartina during these really severe drought events hadn't been described yet. And so we did surveys all up and down the coast for this whole region that was affected by drought, and over again finding this really high association between living vegetation and these otherwise dead areas and the cordgrass growing in these mussel mounds. So cool thing about this interaction is that not only does the vegetation survive during these periods of intense stress, but once the drought subsides, they act as nuclei for recovery, because those standing patches of vegetation then start spreading vegetatively outward. And just as a function of these patches being distributed all out throughout these die-off areas, you get really far more rapid recovery of this ecosystem once the drought subsides. So this mutualism is not only affecting the resistance of the system to an environmental stressor, but is also, accelerating recovery. So it's a cool, resilient story. So we'd really love if any of the reviewers are out there listening to this.
Well, I put a link to the paper in the Hangout on Air URL, so if anyone has any questions about it or wants to check the paper out, they can click through and read it.
Okay, cool, great.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I love that story so much, because it's like Christine was walking around the marsh, she's like, man, look at those patches, they made it. What's going on there? Oh, they all got muscles in them. Very interesting, she says.
Yeah, well, I have to admit, it was John Griffin was out. Not just have to admit, it was something where I think John actually saw the first die-off area, and
Oh
either I
yeah.
was on the island or came out a day or two afterwards, and we just went everywhere on Saplo and started kind of characterizing this. So
Hmm.
it was very much a joint discovery
Wow.
with John. So
Yeah.
We'll have to
John
get
Gervin,
John
who
on
might
here.
who might be listening.
yeah.
He
He
might
might
be. Well, we'll definitely have to get him on here. That's for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Can't
yeah,
escape.
yeah. If he's not listening to this one, you'll have to listen to the one that he's on, Christine, and you can ask him a bunch of questions about what it's like to be so British.
I will, yeah, and he can talk all about how fun it is to work in the marsh too.
Yes,
Really,
because
really
we know
love
that he
working
loves it.
in these southeastern marshes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Uh,
well, so Christine, I want to ask you some like kind of fun questions now. I know, since I know you so well, I know how much you love life history. You're a great natural historian. What is your favorite natural history life history story from marshes or marsh organisms?
oh my gosh. Well, I'll tell you something I've been thinking a lot about lately that I think is pretty cool.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it's one of the most common, numerically abundant things out in the marshes, at least in terms of the macroinvertebrates, are the fiddler crabs.
Hmm.
And you see them just constantly sifting through the upper surface of the marsh. And I just think it's amazing that, without these fiddler crabs, I think the marsh, what it would physically look like is entirely different, not just because they're burrowing and then modifying sort of sediment chemistry, but the amount of microalgae that's in the mud that these fiddler crabs are eating is like astronomical. And so the primary productivity of this marsh, and I know that there's, some studies done from some of the ecosystem ecologists that have worked on these southern marshes, but it's really sinking in and hitting home to me is that the microalgae in this system is a huge driver of production that cascades up the food chain, and the conduit for that, I think, is like these fiddler crabs, sifting through that mud and translating that into biomass that, and they end up being prey items for all kinds of other organisms.
Mhm.
But I think it's this idea that, we think about so much about the vascular plants and the Spartina as being like this huge foundation species of the system, but I think the primary the algae as the sort of primary producer that fuels the food web is like, I don't know, it's just changed my perspective on how I think about what drives the food web versus what supports these organisms, in terms of alleviation of physical stress and provisioning of habitat, and that there's a lot of complementarity. And I haven't been back up into these northern marshes in a while, but I imagine it's something, it's got a different feel to it, but that's maybe a similar type of dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Well, I mean, I think
particularly,
that. Oh, go ahead, Jared.
I was going to say, in particular, things like fiddler crabs are sort of marching north. Um, how that has the potential to change. Will sort of microalgae up north, will that be facilitating that range expansion? Is it, what role is that going to play? And what's the sort of future interplay between top-down and bottom-up forcing, given that range expansion?
Yeah. So I don't know too much about range expansion of fiddler crabs. Are you guys just getting them in higher population densities, or because the species are going to be, pretty well, just mud crabs or the mud fiddlers?
Yeah, well, this is something we should have David Johnson on here. So David Johnson, who's been working at the Plum Island LTER, published a neat little paper called Fiddler in the Marsh. And basically he's been documenting the sort of expansion of fiddlers at Plum Island and points further north. And so new colonies have started up and they seem like they're expanding. So this is something that we've predicted when thinking about warming water. So we've sort of thought for a while, given Eric Sanford's work, that fiddlers aren't further north because of cold waters.
Yeah.
If it warms up, they should move north. And that's what we seem to be seeing in a number of places. So it's sort of this kind of interesting, what will the future hold, particularly if these sort of winter and spring water temperatures continue warming, and is this sort of a predictable climate and crab interaction that may herald the future, as it were.
Yeah, gosh, that's really cool. Thinking about that, just
Yeah.
because of, I mean, part of it, yeah, is like trophically what their impacts are, but then in terms of biogeochemistry as well of these marshes, they aerate the system like nothing else. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll have to talk to David and get more about that. Should be
cool. All
cool.
right,
So
neat.
we actually have our first listener question. It comes from Twitter. John Griffin at JN Griffey, who is watching. He has a question for Christine. He wants to know if there's any active restoration going on after some of the big die-offs that you guys have seen.
As far as I know, other than like personal, like individual property owners sometimes going out and transplanting Spartina because they're devastated by sort of
Yeah.
that their backyards are bare and being picked over by birds and become landing strips for wading birds and stuff like that, where it used to be beautiful salt marsh. And I think they're really concerned about property values because of this. I don't know if, in terms of the drought die-offs that we've been studying, that there's any concerted effort to go in and actively restore any of those systems. So, I can't think. I don't know any offhand.
There you go, John. There's your answer. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for chiming in, John.
Yeah.
Wish you were actively here. It'd be really fun to have you in the chiming in.
Yes, John can definitely hashtag Marsh Chat. We'll get him on here though. All right, Christine. So yeah, you've seen marshes all up and down the coast. Wait, have you been down to South American marshes too?
Yes.
Oh man, so the breadth of marshes that you've seen are enormous. Then, can you pick a favorite marsh?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in the north, I've got to go for different ones geographically, but those out in the Cape Cod National Seashore, out on the Cape. I mean, Wellfleet, the Gut Marsh, that's out there. It was somewhere where, I don't know, special meant a lot to me because I did a lot of like my first kind of marsh ecology there. But then, and the sand dunes out there are just so beautiful, and the complement between the dune communities and the marshes are really spectacular. And then I think about Airport Marsh on Sapelo too, just for the number of hundreds of hours that I've spent there, watching the sun come up and the sun come down and storms coming across those marshes. I mean, so I can't just pick one marsh.
Of course not. Of course not. Awesome. Well, unless we get any more listener questions, my final question, my wrap-up question is another fun one. What is the craziest thing that you've seen in or around a marsh?
I don't know. I was going to say Richard, who is one of the the maintenance guys that worked on Sapelo. But that wouldn't be sort of relevant to the most of our listeners.
No.
I don't know. That's a little bit of a stumper, Mark.
I know. I was just thinking, since we've spent a ton of time in the marsh, maybe what I'll do with our guests is I'll share one of my crazy marsh stories and let you think of a crazy thing that you've seen in the marsh.
Okay.
So I would say one of the craziest / most fun things that I've seen in a marsh occurred down in the southeast. I was working near a creek as the tide was coming up, and I heard a weird noise coming from the creek. It was like a noise, and I was like, that was strange, but I thought it was a fish flopping or something like that. And then I heard another, a couple, and I walked to the edge of the creek, and this was not a very big creek, probably about as wide as a couple of the offices, maybe 20 feet wide or so. And then I see that it's a little pod of dolphins coming in with the high tide, hunting mullet. Actually, dolphins of the southeast are really unique. They do this thing where they chase mullet up onto the banks of the creek and then eat them off of the banks. These guys weren't doing that, but dolphins coming into the creeks to the salt marsh creeks as the tide comes up is a pretty cool, pretty unique thing. So I saw that, and then another time I saw a similar thing. We happened to be out on our boat, and I was encouraged by our PhD student at the time, Dr. James Nifong, and our advisor, Dr. Silliman, to stick my head underwater and listen to them call to each other, and that was pretty cool as well. Just in like this little marsh creek. Yeah, so that's one of the coolest things that I've seen in the marsh.
All right. I just had one. Oh, this was one of the coolest things I've seen. I was out there in the middle of winter, and this like flock of wandering ibis came down, and I don't know if you've ever seen them sort of foraging across a marsh, but the ones in the back end up sort of like getting all the holes after every, the fiddler crab holes. They come through and hit like every single fiddler crab hole when one of these herds comes through. Sorry, Bernetta's she's done with this interview. You pooped your pants in the last few minutes, and so
hey, that makes two of us.
Leaking on my leg, but it's also anyway, so she's having it. But anyways, there must have been 50 ibis that were like in this herd that foraged across the marsh, and they just poked the hell out of all the fiddler crab holes. But it was amazing how thorough, just this one flock was at going through and sort of like mowing through these, fiddler crab burrows. So I've never seen that since, but I mean, it was awesome just to stand there and watch this thing just like migrate across the marsh. So
and super seasonal too, right?
Yeah. Anyways, you guys, well, thanks for the interview. It was fun to talk marsh stuff.
Thanks so much for doing this, Christine. This was awesome.
Yeah. Good luck. You'll have to let me know when you interview others, and I'll try to tune in, ask questions.
Yeah, we'll be posting future interviews to Twitter, mostly, and to our blog at marshlife.org.
Okay.
I guess we'll wrap up. So Christine, thanks so much, and this has been awesome as our inaugural speaker for Marsh Chat.
Sure.
And also, just again, to sort of thank our funding, thanks to MIT Sea Grant for making this possible. Mark, any closing marsh thoughts?
If you have the opportunity, go out and look at a marsh today. I would.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys, and thanks again, Christine. And
Christine.
we'll see you guys later.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Bye.